Hello fellow lovers of the liminal and the weird, and welcome to another video by Liminal Spaces. This is a hard topic for me. I constantly look at my Stephen King shelf and I'm like, I need to do some Stephen King stuff for the channel, and I think I flirted with it a little bit by looking at Stephen King's tension building, specifically in the first 100 pages of the book It. If you want to see my other Stephen King content, that's the one. I've got one on this channel. And I think there's a couple of reasons why I find it so hard to talk about Stephen King. The first is he seems so popular. BookTube is rife with people talking about Stephen King. And I feel that these videos that I'm making I'm doing them in order to put my personal concepts about books that I've read, or my particular interpretations, out into the world, right? But I want them to be unique enough that I'm adding to the conversation. I don't want to just repeat what everybody said, and I'm really afraid in the case of Stephen King that it's going to be very hard not to repeat what other people have already said about something. So that's one of the reasons that I've kind of avoided Stephen King. The other reason is a little bit more complex. So I grew up on fairy tales and fables and Bible stories, all presented in children's books with beautiful illustrations. It made me absolutely love reading. And then I had a very tiny stint where I just started to get into young adult, but young adult at the time that I was growing up was stuff like, I think Beverly Cleary, Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. I think she's the one that wrote that. A tiny bit of Encyclopedia Brown and stuff like that, but I kind of skipped. I barely put my toe in the water of young adult fiction, and then I started reading Cujo by Stephen King. And it's kind of a funny story because it's associated with my first cavity. I had a tooth pain, and it was really bugging me. And I was young. I was like, I think 9 or 10 years old. And I had this tooth pain, and I kept going into the bathroom and brushing my teeth. Like, if I brushed my teeth over and over again, I could somehow get rid of this tooth pain, and which of course didn't work. So finally, I went and I laid in my mom's bed. She was doing stuff around the house. This was kind of the middle of the day, and I needed somehow to distract myself. So I reached up and I grabbed whatever book she was reading at the time, and it happened to be Cujo by Stephen King. So I started reading Cujo, and I read Cujo from that point cover to cover until that evening, and it made me kind of forget about my tooth pain. It was absolutely incredible. I didn't understand a lot of it. There's a lot about adultery and divorce, not even divorce, but separation and stuff in that novel, if I remember it correctly. I haven't read it for years. So it seemed very adult to me, which was part of the joy of reading it, but it was also absolutely terrifying in such a good way, and mysterious. And King became the first adult fiction that I ever read, and I read it voraciously. I was obsessed. I read everything I could by Stephen King as it came out, and I tore through his back catalog. I absolutely loved it. It really, and it started pushing me towards other horror writers, which were harder to find. King was so explosive in the 80s that, I mean, Dean Koontz was usually the next person people mentioned, and then John Saul. And I also got into Peter Straub and H.P. Lovecraft and Edgar Allan Poe. But then I moved away from King. I read him for most of my teenage life, and then right around, I think, Gerald's Game, I read and really enjoyed. And then I think 4 Past Midnight came out after that, and that's where I stopped with Stephen King. I read everything from Carrie to 4 past midnight, including all the Bachman books and everything. And just absolutely adored it. But when I was done, I was done. And I have a tendency to do that when I was younger. When I would move on from something, I would decide that the more childish me in the past had liked that, so I couldn't really care about that anymore. I did the same thing with metal music when I was a kid. It took me a while to come back around to metal music, which I now love again and listen to quite a lot, along with my prog stuff and everything. And King was the same way. I just decided that I was moving on to more highbrow literature and away from King, which was terrible. And it's something that King has fought with most of his career, about genre fiction versus literary fiction, which could be a whole another video. I could run classes on King all day easily. Stephen King's writing is, in my opinion, deep and interesting enough that it could easily have a major part in academia, in academic discussions. Really, really incredible stuff. But anyway, I left him behind. And I didn't come back around to Stephen King until about a year and a half ago, right before we started this channel. And this channel's not a year old yet. So it was, a year, maybe 3 months ago, that I jumped back into Stephen King. And there was little times I flirted with it throughout the years before that. I tried to read Under the Dome and DNF'd it. And I tried to read Lisey's Story, and I DNF'd them both. I couldn't find my way back into Stephen King, and I think those are both good novels that I'll probably try again sometime. But the way that I finally got back into Stephen King is I started finding his books at estate sales and garage sales and started buying them. And I decided to do a reread of his entire bibliography in order. Something that I have now abandoned. I mean, I might come back every once in a while to Stephen King's, but I'm not gonna reread his entire bibliography. It's I just realized pretty quick that it wouldn't necessarily work for me. But I was able to read Carrie, which is still, in my opinion, one of the most fantastic books Stephen King has ever written. This is a first book club edition, and I absolutely enjoyed that reread. That book still holds up so beautifully. Stephen King's character development all over it. Also, I feel like Shirley Jackson's fingerprints are all over that book. Same with The Shining. Really, truly. I think Shirley Jackson was a huge influence on early Stephen King. I read Salem's Lot, which is one that I did not care for much as a kid. I was not a huge fan of vampires back in the day. They seemed like just monsters to me. And I wanted ghosts and mystery and scary hauntings, not things jumping out and eating you, which seemed very monster-like to me. But my reread of this, I absolutely love it. The Marston House stuff, off the hook. Incredible. Oh, that's a first edition later printing of Salem's Lot there. And then I started on The Shining. And I got halfway through this. I was doing this with my buddy, and he finished this up, and I got halfway through it, and then we started the channel. So this got set aside because I was really interested in doing this channel with my brother, and I went up and visited him, and he was like, we were talking about it, and we'd been talking about this channel for a couple of years, and finally he's like, we just got to do it. We got to stop everything we're doing and just start making our entertainment into videos for the channel. So I DNF'd this, and I've now come back and read it again. And first off, I know why this is my favorite. I think this is the best Stephen King that he ever wrote. I absolutely love this. It is a haunting tale times 10. And I think the reason that I have a hard time talking about Stephen King is because I have to separate myself from the nostalgia. I have to go back through and evaluate it and say, is this really good? The way that I do his later work. Is this really good? Is this really worth it? Is this as amazing as I remember it? And in this case, I really think it is, and I'm very excited to dive really, really deeply into this novel. So my Stephen King guy, my favorite Stephen King guy, in fact, the first booktuber that I ever watched was when I started this Stephen King revival. It's when I realized, wow, you can watch videos on YouTube of people talking about books, which blew my mind. So I just looked up Stephen King. And the first booktuber that came up for me was, of course, Mike's book reviews. And I absolutely love Mike's channel. And for me, it started as Stephen King, and I went through and rewatched all of his Stephen King backlog material and really loved it. And one of the things that Mike says in his Stephen King book reviews that I like is that the rereads from when he was a teenager and the reads that he does now introduce so much more, and I found that to be the case, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be discussing as I go through this Stephen King review is how much more there is to this story now that I've read it as an adult than there was when I was reading it as a teenager.